Sarah slumped onto her bed, the springs groaning beneath her. Another Friday night, another movie marathon with herself and a bag of chips. Except, tonight was different. Tonight, Mark was here. Mom's boyfriend. 58 years old, a whole generation older than Sarah, and currently occupying the guest room down the hall. He'd arrived late, the hum of his taxi a dull drone against the backdrop of their quiet suburban street. Sarah had mumbled a polite hello, avoiding eye contact as she helped him wrestle his suitcase through the narrow doorway. He smelled of expensive cologne and something else. Something vaguely metallic, like old pennies. Her mom, Carol, was practically buzzing with excitement. At 42, Carol seemed to have found a renewed spring in her step since Mark had entered the picture. Dinners out, weekend getaways, whispered phone calls late at night. It was all a bit much for Sarah, who preferred the comfortable predictability of their life before. Mark was from out of state, a business acquaintance of Carol's who had, seemingly out of the blue, become much more. Sarah didn't quite understand it. He was polite, sure, and made an effort to engage her in conversation, asking about school and her future plans. But there was something about his eyes, a certain calculating gleam, that made Sarah uneasy. She felt like she was being assessed, measured, and found wanting. The guest room had always been Sarah's sanctuary when she needed to escape. Now, it felt tainted and baited. She wondered if she'd be able to sleep, knowing he was just down the hall. She grabbed her phone, scrolling aimlessly through social media, trying to distract herself from the unsettling feeling that had settled in her stomach. This weekend was going to be awkward, she just knew it. Sarah tried to pinpoint exactly what bothered her about Mark. It wasn't just the age gap, though that certainly played a part. Her mom deserved to be happy, of course, but something about the way Carol seemed to shrink around him, becoming almost girlish, rubbed Sarah the wrong way. Carol was a strong, independent woman, a successful real estate agent who had raised Sarah on her own after her dad left when she was little. She didn't need rescuing, and she certainly didn't need a man who seemed to subtly control every aspect of her life. The first time Sarah met Mark, she'd been genuinely polite. She'd smiled, offered him a drink, and even made an attempt at small talk. But his responses felt rehearsed, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. He seemed more interested in observing her, cataloging her features, than actually getting to know her. He'd commented on her hair, a lovely shade of auburn, quite striking, and her height. You must get that from your father. Each observation delivered with a detached clinicality that made Sarah's skin crawl. Later, after he'd gone to bed, Sarah had confided in her best friend, Emily. "He's just creepy, she'd said, pacing back and forth in her room. "There's something off about him. I can't explain it." Emily, ever the pragmatist, had scoffed. "You're just being overprotective of your mom. Give the guy a chance. Maybe he's just nervous." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just nerves. There was a darkness lurking beneath Mark's polished exterior, a sense of something hidden and potentially dangerous. And the thought of him staying in their house, so close to her and her mom, filled her with a growing sense of dread. She wished he would just go back where he came from. Later that night, Sarah woke up thirsty. The air in her room was thick and still, and the silence pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She glanced at the digital clock on her nightstand, 3:17 a.m. Groaning, she pushed herself out of bed, her bare feet padding softly on the carpet. She grabbed her water bottle from her desk, realizing it was empty. The kitchen was downstairs, a trek she usually avoided at this hour. But her throat felt like sandpaper, so she decided to risk it. She pulled on her longest sleep shirt, a faded band tee that reached almost to her knees, and crept out of her room. She didn't bother with slippers. She wanted to be as quiet as possible. The hallway was dimly lit by the faint glow of the nightlight in the bathroom. As she tiptoed past the guest room, the door creaked open slightly. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Had she imagined it? She held her breath, listening for any sound. Then, Mark emerged from the room. He was wearing a dark robe, his hair disheveled. He hadn't seen her yet. Sarah instinctively flattened herself against the wall, trying to blend into the shadows. As he turned and started walking in her direction, she realized she was trapped. He was coming right toward her. She considered ducking back into her room, but it was too late. He would see her. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. His gaze lingered on her bare legs, visible beneath the hem of her sleep shirt. His expression changed, something flickering in his eyes that she couldn't quite decipher. It wasn't the polite, distant look he usually gave her. This was something else entirely. Something intense. He didn't say anything, but the silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She grabbed her water bottle tighter, her knuckles turning white. She needed to get out of there. Sarah mumbled a quick, "Sorry," and hurried past him, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She practically sprinted down the stairs and into the kitchen, fumbling with the water filter on the faucet. The cold water stung her dry throat as she gulped it down, trying to calm her racing pulse. Back in her room, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, taking deep breaths. What was that look? It was unsettling, predatory almost. She replayed the scene in her head, trying to make sense of it. Had she imagined it? Was she just being paranoid? She changed into shorts and a t-shirt, suddenly feeling exposed and vulnerable in just her sleep shirt. She couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was watching her, even though she knew he was probably back in his room. After tossing and turning for what felt like hours, she finally drifted back to sleep. But her dreams were filled with shadows and unsettling images of Mark, his eyes following her, his smile cold and calculating. When she woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through her window. She felt groggy and disoriented, like she hadn't slept at all. The encounter in the hallway felt like a distant nightmare, but the unease lingered. As she got ready for the day, she couldn't help but glance at her bedroom door. An idea, reckless and dangerous, began to form in her mind. She knew it was wrong, she knew it was playing with fire, but she couldn't resist the urge to test the waters, to see if she had truly imagined that look in Mark's eyes. She left her bedroom door cracked open, just a sliver, barely enough to see through. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it was a clear invitation. She told herself she was just curious, that she wanted to prove to herself that she was wrong about him. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. A dangerous curiosity, a reckless desire to see how far he would go. The house was quiet. Carol had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen counter saying she'd be home late. Mark was still asleep, presumably. Sarah busied herself with mundane tasks, making breakfast, doing a load of laundry, anything to distract herself from the growing knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside her window, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She kept glancing at the sliver of light spilling into the hallway from her open door, half expecting, half dreading, to see Mark standing there. Hours passed. The morning stretched into the afternoon. Sarah tried to focus on her schoolwork, but her mind kept wandering back to the hallway, to the look in Mark's eyes, to the open door. She felt like she was walking a tightrope, balancing on the edge of something dangerous and unknown. Finally, she heard it. A slow, deliberate creaking of the floorboards outside her room. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him. She knew it. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it would burst out of her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to stay calm. She could still get up, close the door, pretend she hadn't heard anything. But she didn't move. The footsteps grew closer, slower, more deliberate. She could almost feel his presence outside her door, a dark and looming shadow. He was right there. She waited, paralyzed with a mixture of fear and anticipation. This was it. This was the moment of truth. Would he stop? Would he turn around? Or would he cross the threshold, stepping into the dangerous game she had initiated? The footsteps stopped just outside her door. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, broken only by the frantic beating of her heart. She didn't open her eyes. She didn't make a sound. She simply waited, holding her breath, as the world stood still. She didn't stop them. The door creaked open wider, the sliver of light expanding to reveal Mark standing in the doorway. He was dressed in the same dark robe he had worn the night before, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stood there, watching her. Sarah finally opened her eyes, her gaze locking with his. His eyes were dark and intense, and she couldn't detect a hint of apology or embarrassment in them. It was as if he had been expecting this, as if he knew all along that she would leave the door open. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice a low rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. It was the first time he had said her name without the polite, detached formality she had come to expect. This was different. This was intimate. She didn't respond, couldn't respond. She was frozen, caught in his gaze like a deer in headlights. She knew she should say something, tell him to leave, but the words wouldn't come. He took a step into the room, then another. He was closer now, his presence filling the small space. She could smell his cologne, the same expensive scent from the night before, but it was mixed with something else now, something musky and animalistic. "I couldn't sleep," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I had to see you." Sarah's mind was racing. What was happening? Was this really happening? She had wanted to test him, to see how far he would go, but she hadn't expected him to actually cross the line. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers sending a jolt of electricity through her. His touch was surprisingly soft, almost tender. "You're very beautiful, Sarah," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your mother is a lucky woman." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Sarah knew that he wasn't just talking about her beauty, that he was saying something else entirely. And in that moment, she realized that she had made a terrible mistake. She had opened a door that she might not be able to close. Sarah's breath hitched. She wanted to recoil from his touch, to scream, but she was paralyzed by a strange combination of fear and morbid curiosity. She stared up at him, her mind racing, trying to calculate her next move. He dropped his hand, a slight smile playing on his lips. "I shouldn't be here," he said, but he didn't move. "Your mother would be very upset." The mention of her mother snapped Sarah out of her daze. Guilt washed over her, hot and stinging. What was she doing? This was her mother's boyfriend, a man who was supposed to be a guest in their home. And she was standing here, allowing him to, what? Seduce her. "You need to leave," she said, her voice trembling slightly. It wasn't a demand, more of a plea. Mark's smile widened, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Are you sure that's what you want, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a low purr. He took another step closer, invading her personal space. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, the weight of his gaze pressing down on her. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger this time. "I want you to leave. Now." He paused, considering her for a moment. Then, with a sigh, he nodded. "As you wish," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. He turned and walked towards the door, his movements slow and deliberate. He paused in the doorway, turning back to look at her one last time. "But I'll be back, Sarah," he said, his eyes promising something she didn't want to understand. "You can't resist me forever." And then he was gone, leaving Sarah alone in her room, trembling and breathless. She slammed the door shut and locked it, collapsing against it, her body shaking uncontrollably. What had just happened? Had she imagined it all? She knew, deep down, that she hadn't. Mark had crossed a line, and she had let him. And now she was trapped in a dangerous game, with no idea how to escape. She was more trapped than before. The rest of the weekend was a blur of forced smiles and awkward silences. Sarah avoided Mark as much as possible, sticking close to her mother whenever he was around. But even when they weren't in the same room, she could feel his eyes on her, watching her, waiting. He would find ways to be alone with her, even for just a few minutes. A quick word in the kitchen while Carol was in the shower, a lingering touch on her arm as he passed her in the hallway. Each encounter was brief, but charged with an unspoken tension that left Sarah feeling breathless and disoriented. He never explicitly mentioned what had happened in her room, but his words and actions were filled with subtle innuendo, veiled promises that made her skin crawl. He would compliment her on her appearance, tell her how much she reminded him of a younger Carol, or ask her about her dreams and aspirations, always with that same knowing glint in his eyes. Sarah found herself both repulsed and strangely drawn to him. She hated the way he made her feel, the way he seemed to see right through her, exposing her deepest insecurities and desires. But there was also a part of her that was intrigued by him, by the danger and forbiddenness of their interactions. She started to dress differently, choosing clothes that were more revealing, more attention-grabbing. She caught herself flirting with him, almost unconsciously, drawn into his web of manipulation. She knew it was wrong, she knew she should stop, but she couldn't seem to help herself. The power dynamic between them was constantly shifting. Sometimes, she felt like she was in control, leading him on, playing with him. Other times, she felt like she was a puppet, dancing to his tune, powerless to resist his influence. Her feelings for him were equally confusing. She hated him, she resented him, she feared him. But there was also a strange kind of fascination, an almost magnetic pull that she couldn't explain. She was trapped in a toxic cycle of attraction and repulsion, unable to break free from his spell. Sarah's behavior began to change. She became withdrawn and secretive, spending more time in her room, avoiding eye contact with her mother. Her grades slipped, she stopped hanging out with her friends as much, and she lost interest in the things she used to enjoy. She was constantly on edge, jumpy, and irritable. She would lash out at her mother for no reason, then retreat into herself, consumed by guilt and remorse. She felt like she was living a double life, constantly trying to hide her true feelings from the world. Her dreams became more vivid and disturbing, filled with images of Mark, sometimes seductive, sometimes menacing. She would wake up in the middle of the night, sweating and breathless, unable to shake off the feeling that he was watching her, even in her sleep. Her appetite fluctuated wildly. Sometimes she would binge on junk food, trying to fill the emptiness inside her. Other times, she couldn't bring herself to eat anything at all, the guilt and anxiety churning in her stomach. She started to isolate herself from her friends, afraid that they would see through her facade, that they would discover her secret. She pushed Emily away, inventing excuses to avoid her, knowing that she couldn't confide in her without revealing the truth about Mark. Her relationship with her mother became strained and distant. She could sense that Carol was picking up on her changed behavior, but she didn't know how to explain it. She couldn't tell her the truth, not without shattering her world, not without destroying their relationship. She felt like she was slowly losing herself, disappearing into a fog of guilt, fear, and confusion. She was trapped in a nightmare of her own making, with no way out. The once vibrant and carefree Sarah was fading away, replaced by a shadow of her former self, haunted by the memory of that night in the hallway and the dangerous game she had started. One evening, Carol came home early from work, looking pale and shaken. She announced that she had been having some financial difficulties with her real estate business and that Mark had offered to help her out. He was going to invest a significant amount of money in her company, essentially becoming her partner. Sarah's heart sank. This meant Mark would be around even more, that he would have even more control over their lives. She tried to protest, to warn her mother about Mark, but Carol wouldn't listen. She was blinded by gratitude and infatuation, convinced that Mark was her savior. A few days later, Sarah overheard a phone conversation between Mark and someone she didn't recognize. He was speaking in hushed tones, his voice cold and calculating. He mentioned something about taking care of a problem and making sure she stays quiet. Sarah's blood ran cold. Who was he talking about? Was he talking about her? She suddenly felt a surge of fear, realizing that she was in over her head, that she had stumbled into something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. That night, Sarah found a crumpled piece of paper in Mark's study. It was a photograph of her, taken without her knowledge. On the back of the photo, someone had written a single word: watch. Sarah knew she had to do something. She couldn't let Mark continue to manipulate her and her mother. She couldn't let him control their lives. But she didn't know what to do. She was afraid of him, afraid of what he was capable of. She decided to confide in Emily, to finally tell her the truth about Mark. But when she called her, Emily didn't answer. She tried again and again, but Emily's phone went straight to voicemail. Then, Sarah received a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Stay away from Emily. You don't want anything to happen to her." Sarah's world shattered. Mark was threatening her friends, isolating her from her support system. She was completely alone, trapped in his web of deceit and manipulation. And she knew, with chilling certainty, that he wasn't going to let her go. One afternoon, Sarah came home from school to find Mark and Carol arguing in the living room. Carol was crying, her face red and blotchy. Mark was standing over her, his voice low and menacing. "You're not going anywhere, Carol," he said, his grip tightening on her arm. "You owe me everything." Sarah rushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "Leave her alone, Mark," she shouted, her voice trembling with fear and anger. Mark turned to face her, his eyes blazing with fury. "This is none of your business, Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "It is my business," she retorted, her voice growing stronger. "She's my mother, and you're hurting her." Mark laughed, a cold and cruel sound that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "You think you can stop me, Sarah?" he said, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're so strong." He took a step towards her, his hand raised as if to strike her. Sarah flinched, bracing herself for the impact. But then Carol stepped in front of her, shielding her from Mark's wrath. "Don't you dare touch her," she screamed, her voice filled with a newfound defiance. Mark hesitated, his expression shifting from anger to surprise. He lowered his hand, his gaze softening slightly. "Carol, please," he said, his voice pleading. "You don't understand." "No, Mark," Carol said, her voice firm. "I understand perfectly. You're a monster." She turned to Sarah, her eyes filled with tears and regret. "I'm so sorry, Sarah," she said, her voice breaking. "I should have listened to you. I should have seen what he really was." In that moment, Sarah knew that she had to protect her mother, that she had to do whatever it took to get rid of Mark. She had to confront the consequences of her actions, to take responsibility for the dangerous game she had started. She knew that it wouldn't be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She was ready to fight. The moment of truth had arrived. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Carol, finally seeing Mark for who he was, ordered him out of the house. He left, but not without a string of threats and accusations, promising to ruin them both. The police were called, and Sarah and Carol spent hours giving statements, recounting the events of the past few weeks. Carol was devastated, not only by Mark's betrayal, but also by her own blindness, her own willingness to ignore the warning signs. The financial implications were severe. Mark had indeed invested a large sum of money in Carol's business, but he had also taken out loans in her name, leaving her with a mountain of debt. Her reputation was tarnished, her business was in jeopardy, and she was facing the prospect of losing everything. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She knew that she was partly responsible for what had happened, that her initial curiosity and recklessness had set the stage for Mark's manipulation. She blamed herself for not speaking up sooner, for not protecting her mother. Her relationship with Carol was strained, but also strengthened by their shared experience. There were tears, recriminations, and painful confessions, but also a deep sense of love and forgiveness. Carol was angry with Sarah for her actions, but she also understood that Sarah had been manipulated and exploited by Mark. Sarah's self-perception had been shattered. She no longer saw herself as innocent or naive. She had been complicit in a dangerous game, and she had paid the price. She felt ashamed, disgusted with herself for allowing Mark to get so close, for letting him into her life. She started therapy, trying to unpack the trauma she had experienced, to understand her own motivations and vulnerabilities. It was a long and difficult process, but she was determined to heal, to rebuild her life, and to never make the same mistakes again. She had to come to terms with what she had done. It changed everything. Therapy became Sarah's lifeline. She learned about grooming, manipulation, and the subtle ways in which Mark had exerted control over her. She explored her own insecurities, her need for validation, and the reasons why she had been so vulnerable to his advances. She started to reconnect with her friends, apologizing for pushing them away, explaining what she had been going through. Emily was understanding and supportive, offering Sarah a safe space to talk and process her emotions. Their friendship was tested, but ultimately strengthened by the experience. Sarah also started volunteering at a local women's shelter, working with other young women who had experienced similar forms of abuse. She found solace in helping others, in sharing her story, and in knowing that she wasn't alone. She realized that her experience with Mark, while traumatic, had also made her stronger, more resilient, and more aware of the dangers that lurked beneath the surface of seemingly normal relationships. She learned to trust her instincts, to set boundaries, and to stand up for herself. She also had to come to terms with her own actions, with the fact that she had played a role in what had happened. She had to forgive herself for her mistakes, to accept that she was not perfect, and to move forward with a newfound sense of self-awareness and compassion. It was a long and arduous journey, filled with setbacks and challenges, but Sarah was determined to heal, to reclaim her life, and to emerge from the darkness a stronger and wiser person. She started journaling, writing down her thoughts and feelings, processing her emotions, and tracking her progress. She began to see the world in a new light, recognizing the subtle power dynamics that existed in all relationships and learning to navigate them with greater awareness and caution. She was learning to love herself again. The scars remained, but they were a reminder of what she had overcome, a testament to her strength and resilience. She was discovering herself again. She was no longer the naive girl who had left her door ajar. She was a survivor. Mark was eventually brought to justice. The police investigation revealed a pattern of similar behavior with other women, and he was charged with fraud, manipulation, and emotional abuse. He pleaded guilty to some of the charges, avoiding a lengthy trial, and was sentenced to several years in prison. Carol, with Sarah's unwavering support, managed to rebuild her business, slowly but surely paying off the debt that Mark had left behind. It was a long and difficult process, but she persevered, determined to reclaim her independence and financial stability. Their relationship, once strained and distant, became stronger and more resilient. They learned to communicate openly and honestly, to trust each other, and to support each other through thick and thin. They were no longer just mother and daughter, they were allies, confidants, and best friends. Sarah never fully forgave Mark for what he had done, but she also refused to let him define her life. She chose to focus on healing, on moving forward, and on creating a future filled with love, joy, and meaningful connections. She continued to volunteer at the women's shelter, sharing her story and helping other survivors reclaim their lives. She became an advocate for awareness and prevention, speaking out against manipulation and abuse, and empowering other young women to stand up for themselves. Carol eventually found love again, with a kind and trustworthy man who treated her with respect and admiration. Sarah was happy for her mother, knowing that she deserved to be loved and cherished. They moved to a new house, leaving behind the memories of Mark and the darkness that had once enveloped their lives. It was a fresh start, a chance to create a new chapter, filled with hope and possibility. They had broken free from Mark's control. They were finally free. Their story was a story of survival. Years later, Sarah sat on the porch of her new home, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple. She was a different person now, stronger, wiser, and more confident than she had ever been before. She reflected on the events of the past, on the choices she had made, and on the lessons she had learned. She realized that life was complex, that relationships were often messy and unpredictable, and that even the most seemingly harmless actions could have unforeseen consequences. She had learned that vulnerability was not a weakness, but a strength, that it was okay to ask for help, and that true connection came from authenticity and honesty. She had learned the importance of trusting her instincts, of setting boundaries, and of standing up for what she believed in. She had also learned that forgiveness was not about condoning the actions of others, but about freeing herself from the burden of resentment and anger. She had forgiven her mother for her blindness, for her willingness to ignore the warning signs, and she had even found a way to forgive herself for her own mistakes. She understood that her experience with Mark, while painful and traumatic, had ultimately shaped her into the person she was today. It had taught her the importance of self-awareness, of empathy, and of compassion. She knew that the scars would always be there, a reminder of what she had been through, but they were also a testament to her resilience, her courage, and her unwavering determination to heal and to thrive. She had learned that life was not about avoiding pain, but about embracing it, about learning from it, and about using it to become a better version of herself. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh, clean air. She was grateful for her life, for her mother, for her friends, and for the opportunity to create a future filled with love, joy, and purpose. She had learned that even in the darkest of times, there was always hope, always a chance for a new beginning. She was finally at peace. The cracked door was closed forever.